It was just before midnight on a quiet summer night in Griffin, Georgia. A young man lay motionless on his bed, blood soaking through the sheets beneath him. A gunshot wound to the chest, too severe, too sudden. And beside him, his girlfriend, crying, shaking, her words a frantic mess. It was an accident, she repeated. But was it? On a warm summer night in Griffin, Georgia, the soft hum of crickets outside was shattered by a gunshot. It echoed through the quiet neighborhood like the crack of thunder on a calm day. Inside a modest home on Sunnybrook Drive, Stephen Freeman lay motionless. His chest was torn open, a gunshot wound that bled out his life far too quickly. His once cheerful face, always smiling, now pale and cold, almost unrecognizable in the pale moonlight. His girlfriend, Katherine Hickden, knelt beside him. Her hands were trembling as she pressed them to his chest, desperately trying to stem the blood, her sobs shaking her entire body. She screamed for help, her voice raw, broken. But no one could hear her. The house was too quiet, too still. She had only been holding the gun a moment ago. Just a moment. How had it gone so wrong? The phone rang out in the darkness, cutting through the chaos in the room. Katherine's voice, gasping and broken, poured through the line to emergency dispatchers. I didn't mean it. It was an accident. I shot him. Please help us. The dispatcher tried to calm her down, but it was impossible. Her words came in fragmented, hysterical bursts. I didn't know the gun was loaded. I didn't mean to. As she spoke, flashing lights lit up the street outside, casting an eerie glow across the quiet neighborhood. Paramedics and police arrived at the scene minutes later. But when they entered the room, they were met with a chilling sight. A young man bleeding out on the bed, his girlfriend kneeling beside him, frantic and inconsolable. The room was filled with panic, but something didn't add up. Police quickly took control of the situation, guiding Katherine away from Stephen's side so paramedics could attempt to save him. The blood on the sheets told a devastating story. The damage was too severe. His pulse had weakened by the minute. Katherine resisted, crying, screaming that she couldn't leave him. The paramedics struggled to pull her away from Stephen's body. She wouldn't let go. I can't lose him, please, she cried. Her voice cracked with the kind of desperation only a lover could understand. When she was finally taken aside, officers began speaking with her. Her account of the events was jumbled and frantic. She repeated her version over and over, how it had been a mistake. She had only been trying to hand Stephen the gun, but something went wrong. The gun fired, she had no idea it was loaded. But the officers couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. They had learned quickly not to trust the first story. It often hid a different truth. As Stephen was rushed to the hospital, his condition deteriorating rapidly, Katherine was brought in for questioning. At first, she stuck to her story, the gun had gone off accidentally. She hadn't been pointing it at Stephen, she said. She had just tried to hand it to him. But the more the officers pressed her, the more inconsistencies slipped through. At one point, she made a fatal slip. When I threw the gun to Stephen, it fired, she said, her voice shaking. I didn't mean to. The words hung in the air. This was no longer the same story she had told at the scene. She had claimed to be handing him the gun, not throwing it. But now, she admitted to recklessly tossing the weapon, knowing full well the potential consequences. She had never mentioned this before. The detectives exchanged glances. This new detail, this shift in her account, raised alarms. Throwing a loaded gun, especially when you're well aware of the dangers, was the last thing anyone would do, especially someone trained in firearms safety. Katherine had worked part-time at a local gun shop. She knew the ins and outs of weapons. She was no novice. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Katherine had lied before. There were more lies yet to be uncovered, each one more damning than the last. Friends and family began speaking to the police, providing a picture of a volatile and controlling relationship. It wasn't the first time Katherine had pointed a gun at Stephen. He had spoken about it before, how she had aimed a weapon at him during heated arguments, how she had become more possessive, more unpredictable. One of Stephen's friends recalled how, during the early years of their relationship, Mary Katherine would get angry and grab a gun, threatening to use it in the heat of an argument. But there was something more. Something more dangerous had begun to brew in the last months of their relationship. According to Stephen's close friends, he had been planning to leave. He had reached his limit. Stephen had been trying to escape the constant emotional turmoil. Just days before the shooting, Stephen had confided in a friend about his plans to move away, to start fresh, away from Mary Katherine. But he never made it to that day. On August 1st, just days before Stephen had planned to leave, the argument reached its breaking point. That evening, Mary Katherine had prepared Stephen's favorite meal, roast beef, his comfort food. She had hoped it might coax him back. But when he didn't return her calls, when he didn't show up, her frustration turned to anger. She went looking for him. She found him at a friend's house, in the passenger seat of a car. She confronted him, demanding answers. She wanted him to come home with her, to fix things. But Stephen was done. Tired. Defeated. He agreed to go back with her, trying to keep the peace. But what happened next was far from peaceful. 2 hours later, Stephen Freeman was rushed to the hospital. A bullet wound in his chest. A single, fatal shot. He was pronounced dead just before midnight. Mary Katherine had called for help. But in the moments before the gunshot, something darker had unfolded, something they hadn't yet figured out. Was it an accident? Or was it something else entirely? This case is far from over. A death that seemed like an accident might not have been one at all. If you're captivated by true crime and want to know what happened next, please like and subscribe now. Your support helps us bring you more content like this. With Stephen dead and Mary Katherine in police custody, the case went to trial. Prosecutors had a simple theory. It was not an accident, it was an act of rage. They pointed to the physical evidence, the grease on the gun, the food thrown across the kitchen, the bloodstains on the bed. But the defense countered with their own version of events. They painted Stephen as the aggressor, controlling, emotionally volatile, and violent. The courtroom grew tense as both sides presented their versions of the truth. But the biggest surprise was still to come. The trial of Mary Katherine Hickden was already controversial. Public opinion was divided. Some believed it was a tragic accident, a horrible mistake. Others were sure that it was an act of rage. But as the evidence was laid out before the jury, the truth seemed far more complicated than either side had anticipated. Prosecutors took the stand with their theory. This was no accident. This was murder. They presented a damning case. Physical evidence suggested that Stephen Freeman had been shot while sitting upright on the mattress. Bloodstains on the bed, concentrated around the corner, indicated that he had not been standing or moving when the shot was fired. The kitchen, too, was a crucial piece of the puzzle. It was in chaos. Plates were broken, food scattered across the floor. The scene was not one of a peaceful reconciliation. It looked more like the aftermath of a violent argument. And then, there was the gun. The gun itself had grease on it, as though someone had prepared it beforehand. This wasn't the careless mistake of an untrained person, it was the action of someone who knew what they were doing. Mary Katherine's story had shifted several times since that night. At first, she claimed it was an accident. Then, she admitted she had thrown the gun to Stephen. Later, she claimed self-defense. But the inconsistencies were too much for the prosecution to ignore. Her story had changed multiple times, with no coherent explanation for why she had been holding the gun in the first place. And the questions just kept coming. Why had she never mentioned Stephen's alleged violence before? Why had she never reported the supposed abuse? Where was the evidence to back up her claims? The defense team was ready. They weren't going to let the prosecution's version of events define their client. They had a story of their own to tell, one that painted Stephen Freeman as a much darker figure than anyone had ever imagined. Mary Katherine took the stand, and her voice trembled as she recounted the years she had spent with Stephen. To the jury, she appeared broken, fragile, almost a victim of her circumstances. "He wasn't the person you all thought he was," she testified, wiping away a tear. "Behind closed doors, he was different. He controlled everything I did. He made me feel small. Like I didn't matter. I was scared of him. And on that night, he was angry, again." Her story echoed the defense's argument that Stephen had been emotionally abusive, jealous, and violent. They presented text messages between the two that were filled with anger and threats. The defense argued that these messages were proof of the emotional abuse that Mary Katherine had endured. "He called me worthless. He told me I'd never amount to anything." She claimed that on the night of the shooting, Stephen had pushed her, thrown food in her face, and tried to force her out of the apartment. That's when she said she grabbed the gun, fear driving her every move. The prosecution's case was severely hampered by a single, catastrophic flaw, one that would haunt them for the rest of the trial. Just hours before the shooting, Mary Katherine had been interrogated by police. During that interview, she had reportedly confessed to pulling the trigger in a fit of rage. But the confession was never heard. The police recording equipment had malfunctioned. The video feed was fine, but the audio was ruined by a constant buzzing sound. The moment Mary Katherine allegedly confessed, her words were lost in static. The prosecution had no confession to rely on. It was as though the most critical piece of evidence had vanished without a trace. The timing of Mary Katherine's search history would add more fuel to the fire. Investigators uncovered something chilling. Just hours before the shooting, Mary Katherine had been searching violent, aggressive adult websites, content that hinted at disturbing fantasies. The prosecution used this to question her motivations. How could someone who claimed to be traumatized by abuse willingly engage with such content? How could she deny the possibility that something darker had been at play? Mary Katherine denied that she had any personal interest in the content. She insisted she had searched it out only to please Stephen, to keep him happy. But the timing, just hours before the shooting, was hard to ignore. Stephen Freeman's friends and family took the stand to tell their side of the story. One after another, they described a relationship filled with tension, possessiveness, and danger. Stephen had been planning to leave. They knew it. His friends knew it. He had been afraid of Mary Katherine's increasingly erratic behavior. She was controlling. She wouldn't let him go. He was suffocating in that relationship, a close friend testified. He said something had changed in her. He was scared of her. For the first time, I think he really believed she could hurt him. But despite these warning signs, Stephen had never filed a police report. He never formally accused Mary Katherine of anything. He had kept his fears to himself, perhaps because he didn't want to believe what was happening. He loved her, after all. Despite all the emotional testimony and compelling evidence, the defense had one last surprise in store: expert witnesses for both sides. The defense brought in a psychologist who testified that Mary Katherine showed clear signs of battered woman syndrome. She had been a victim of emotional and physical abuse, and her actions that night were a product of fear and desperation. The prosecution countered with their own expert witness, who argued that Mary Katherine exhibited no signs of such abuse. According to their expert, the changes in her behavior could be attributed to something far more sinister: a need for control, and a lack of remorse for her actions. The jury sat in silence, weighing the conflicting stories, the shifting narratives, and the evidence that seemed to contradict itself at every turn. Mary Katherine's fate rested in their hands. For hours, they deliberated, each juror questioning what they believed to be the truth. Was she a victim? Or was she a manipulative woman who had taken a life in a moment of rage? What would the jury decide? Would Mary Katherine walk free, or would the truth finally catch up with her? Stay tuned, because the shocking verdict will change everything. When the doors of the courtroom finally opened, the weight of the decision was palpable. The jury had returned. Their faces were a mix of relief and confusion. The verdict was read aloud. Not guilty. Mary Katherine Hickden was acquitted of all charges. There were no gasps in the courtroom. No cheers. Only a collective silence that lingered, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Stephen's family was devastated. His mother, especially, could barely contain her grief. She had lost her son, and now, she felt as if she had lost him all over again. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind Mary Katherine Hickden as she left, a free woman. But outside, the storm was only beginning. The public, those who had followed the case from the start, felt the weight of a decision that didn't seem to fit the truth. It wasn't just the victims' families who were left in turmoil. The police, the prosecution, and the defense all faced the same haunting question: could the confession have truly been lost? Earlier, during her interrogation, Mary Katherine had admitted to pulling the trigger. She had confessed, in a moment of broken emotion, that she had done it in a fit of anger. But now, that confession was gone. The video was fine, but the audio, the most vital piece of evidence, had been destroyed. A steady, grating buzz had drowned out every word she spoke. It was as if the truth had been stolen from them by the very technology that was supposed to record it. The police were horrified when they realized the mistake. The interrogation room's recording equipment had malfunctioned during the crucial moment. The confession that could have sealed the case, that could have changed everything, was now completely inaudible. The officers had no explanation for what happened. They had checked the equipment beforehand. They had ensured that everything was working, but when it mattered most, the truth couldn't be heard. It felt like a cruel twist of fate. The prosecution had hoped to rely on that confession to seal Mary Katherine's fate. Without it, they had nothing more than circumstantial evidence and a faulty investigation. In the aftermath, detectives and investigators spent days trying to recover the audio from the corrupted file. It was an exercise in futility. The words were lost forever. News of the acquittal spread quickly through Griffin, Georgia. The community, once supportive of Stephen, was now torn in half. Some felt sympathy for Mary Katherine, believing she had been a victim of emotional abuse herself. They saw the acquittal as a victory for the misunderstood, the silent sufferers of toxic relationships. But Stephen's friends, his family, and those who truly knew him, felt betrayed. They couldn't shake the feeling that the real story had been buried, hidden behind Mary Katherine's carefully constructed version of events. It's not just about the trial. It's about who she really is, one of Stephen's closest friends said in an interview after the verdict. He was trying to leave. He was scared of her. And now she gets to go free? The more they reflected, the more they realized how many times Stephen had tried to escape her grip. They began to understand the true weight of his words, the words he had confided in them, how he had truly feared for his life. Stephen's mother became an unexpected advocate. She couldn't let her son's name be forgotten, nor could she allow the world to think his death had been just another tragic accident. With a quiet but unyielding resolve, she started speaking out about domestic violence. She spoke of her son's pain, his struggle to break free, and the subtle signs of emotional and physical abuse that had been hidden from the public eye. Abuse doesn't always look the same, she said in one of her first interviews. It's not always physical. It's the control, the isolation. It's the mental torment. It's the fear of being stuck, of being silenced. Her efforts grew into a movement, a call for recognition of domestic violence in relationships, particularly for men. She emphasized that abuse didn't have a gender, that men, too, were often overlooked as victims. Stephen never filed a police report. He didn't want to make waves. He loved her. And that's the part that hurts the most. He believed in her until the end. The media picked up on her words, and soon, Stephen's story became a symbol for a wider issue. Domestic violence was no longer just a women's issue. It was a human issue, and Stephen's mother was determined to raise awareness and change the conversation. Despite Mary Katherine's acquittal, there were still questions surrounding the evidence, or lack thereof. Investigators and the public alike questioned the police's handling of the scene, particularly the gun itself. The weapon was found beside Stephen's body, but its positioning was never properly documented. The police hadn't removed Mary Katherine from the room to secure the area, and they hadn't taken crucial photos that could have shown the gun's original placement. How do you lose something as important as that? One investigator said, exasperated. We should have had that gun documented properly. It could have been a game changer. The prosecution had emphasized this issue during the trial, but without concrete answers, the jury was left to rely on their own interpretations of the evidence. Was it an accident, or was it intentional? Was Mary Katherine's story simply a smokescreen to cover up a darker truth? While Mary Katherine was free, Stephen was gone. His family and friends were left to remember him, not for his tragic end, but for the man he had been. The community mourned, but they also began to question the justice system. Could it truly protect those who couldn't protect themselves? Could it really bring justice to victims like Stephen? Stephen's best friend recalled a conversation he had had with Stephen just a few months before his death. Stephen had been planning to leave Mary Katherine. He was scared, but he was determined. He was ready to start over, to live a life free of the control and emotional torment that had plagued him for years. He was so close. He had a plan. He was going to get away from her, his friend said. But that night, it all went wrong. This conversation replayed in the minds of his friends and family. They wondered how different things might have been if Stephen had gotten out before it was too late. The thought haunted them. But then, something unexpected happened. A breakthrough. New evidence came to light, hidden in a way no one had anticipated. A friend of Mary Katherine's came forward with a shocking revelation. They claimed that Mary Katherine had once confessed to them, off the record, that Stephen had been trying to leave her for months, and that she had become increasingly desperate to keep him. The friend also admitted that Mary Katherine had made disturbing comments about not wanting to let go of Stephen, that she'd never let him get away. She said it once, "If I can't have him, no one will." She said that about him, not just once but more than once, the friend admitted under anonymity. This new testimony could change everything, but by then, it was too late. The trial had ended. Mary Katherine was free, and Stephen Freeman's family was left with only their grief and the growing certainty that they would never get the full truth. Despite everything, Stephen's mother continued her advocacy. She traveled the country, speaking about her son's life, the hidden nature of abuse in relationships, and how domestic violence could affect anyone, regardless of gender. "I'll make sure Stephen's name is remembered. Not just as a victim, but as someone who tried to fight, who wanted to escape. We can't let this be his legacy." She became a symbol for change. Stephen's story was no longer just a local tragedy. It was a call for recognition of the quiet battles that so many people face in abusive relationships. And even though Mary Katherine had walked free, Stephen's name was now part of a larger movement for justice, one that wouldn't be silenced. The day after the trial ended, the community of Griffin, Georgia, found itself divided. The courthouse steps were filled with reporters, but the voices of the victims' families were louder than any others. The media outlets flocked to Mary Katherine, interviewing her as she walked out of the courthouse a free woman. But her face didn't hold the relief one might expect after an acquittal. There was no triumph, no sense of victory. Instead, her eyes remained vacant, as though the weight of the trial had never really left her. For Stephen's family, the moment was a painful reminder that their fight for justice had been in vain. His mother couldn't bring herself to watch the interviews. She was left in the quiet of her grief, unable to understand how the justice system had let this woman walk free. "We failed him," Stephen's mother said quietly in an interview, her voice breaking. "I failed him. I couldn't protect him." And now she gets to go back to her life as if nothing happened. In the days following the trial, Stephen's mother became an outspoken advocate for domestic violence awareness. She spoke with anyone who would listen about the signs of emotional abuse, how it can wear down a person over time, until they feel they have nowhere to turn. She was particularly vocal about the abuse Stephen had suffered, even if he had never spoken about it directly to authorities. "You don't need physical bruises to be a victim. It's the scars you can't see that hurt the most," she would often say during her public appearances. "I know my son's pain. He wasn't perfect, but no one deserves what he went through." Her advocacy brought her to countless groups that helped men who were victims of domestic violence, an area that had often been overlooked. Stephen's story, she hoped, would raise awareness about the invisible battles that many men face behind closed doors. Stephen's friends, too, couldn't let the truth remain buried. They shared the conversations they had had with him in the months leading up to his death. Months after the trial, the reverberations of the case were still being felt. Mary Katherine's acquittal didn't sit right with many, and the question on everyone's mind was, how could the justice system let this happen? How could someone who was so well trained in firearms, who had worked at a gun shop, act so recklessly? And yet, the evidence against her wasn't enough to secure a conviction. Her changing stories, the inconsistencies in her statements, and the lack of physical evidence were all part of the reason the jury had acquitted her. But many believed that the flaws in the investigation, missing audio evidence, mishandled forensic work, had ultimately led to her walking free. We all knew it was her. We knew what happened. But in the eyes of the law, there wasn't enough to prove it. There wasn't enough to convict her, one of Stephen's friends said, shaking his head. It feels like we failed him. The system failed him. The case raised larger questions about the gaps in the justice system. Could someone with a history of abusive behavior and manipulative tactics ever truly be held accountable for their actions? Was it possible to find justice for victims like Stephen who had tried to speak out but couldn't because they feared the consequences? Stephen Freeman's story wasn't one that could be easily forgotten, even though the world had moved on from the trial. His mother, forever changed by his death, refused to let his story slip through the cracks. She had fought for his memory, and she was not done fighting. She turned her focus to helping others who had suffered in silence. Stephen's name became part of the conversation about domestic violence awareness, especially in men. The world had seen victims as women, but now, thanks to Stephen's story, the narrative began to shift. If there's anything positive that comes from this tragedy, it's that Stephen's story might help someone else, his mother said, as she spoke to groups around the country. Maybe it will give someone the strength to leave before it's too late. She continued to speak at rallies, conferences, and awareness campaigns, bringing light to the darkness that surrounded domestic violence. It wasn't just about her son's death anymore, it was about making sure no one else had to endure the same fate. Despite everything, the bitterness of Mary Katherine's acquittal lingered. Stephen's family couldn't shake the feeling that justice had been denied. They struggled to find peace with the fact that the woman responsible for their son's death would never pay the price they believed she should. For Mary Katherine, life went on. She moved forward, untouched by the consequences that others had hoped would come. She remained silent in public, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain she had caused. But for those who loved Stephen, the scars would never heal. She's walking free, but she'll never be free of what she did, Stephen's friend said quietly, staring out the window as if he could see the truth outside. She might have been acquitted, but we all know what happened. And we'll never forget. As the years passed, Stephen Freeman's story became more than just a tragedy. It became a call to action, a reminder of the unspoken suffering that so many endure in toxic relationships. His mother's work continued, and her voice grew louder, reaching those who needed to hear it the most. I want the world to know that abuse can happen to anyone. It's not always visible. It doesn't always leave bruises. But that doesn't mean it's not real, she said in one final interview. Stephen's story will live on. It will help others. That's the only thing that gives me peace now. Stephen's legacy was no longer just the tragedy of a life cut short. It was about the change he sparked in the conversation about domestic violence and the support of those who are suffering, often in silence. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through the case of Stephen Freeman and Mary Katherine Hickden. If you or someone you know is suffering from domestic violence, remember, you are not alone. Speak out. Seek help. And if you're moved by this story, share it. Let's continue the conversation and bring justice to those who need it most. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true crime investigations that delve deep into the darkest corners of human nature.